It's the subtlety and the simplicity of a watch and its execution, understanding its origins, the core traits that made it what it was, what it is today, that allows for a watch to have longevity and an everlasting design. That is what this piece represents. That's why it's special. That's why it's worth your attention. It defines 30 years of history and does it effortlessly. We talk about coincidence. Over the last month and a half, I have been rewatching the entire Brosnan and Craig era Bond films. So from 1995 until 2022, I have seen how this character has changed, as well as the fact that I've seen how Omega and its partnership with Bond has evolved. It so beautifully coincides with this video because of the anniversary release. I feel a bit more qualified to talk about how this watch has been through a journey. And through it all, we can learn a lot about product placement, how it was done quite casually and then a little bit ham-fisted, as well as how some designs worked and some truly didn't. And before we get into the video, on the wrist today is the Tudor FXD. Quite a fitting watch when we're talking about this theme of blue accents, simplicity, minimalism, and a watch that also manages to epitomize the quintessence of its design features and its design origins. The Omega Bond partnership, I think it's one of the best that the world has to offer. We talk about brand recognition, James Bond wearing an Omega, it's just a part of the vernacular today. After watching all of these films, seeing them in chronological order, I step back and think to myself, what would Bond be like without Omega, and what would Omega be like without Bond? The answer is, I believe that they would be perceived as two very different entities. What people fail to mention, and it's incredibly important, especially when we talk about the earliest generations of the Seamaster Professional, is that it was a dying watch. The Seamaster collection was nowhere near as strong as it is now. The 1993 Seamaster Professional was one of those last-ditch efforts to create an exciting product that would appeal to a mass audience. It just so happened that by 1995, when GoldenEye arrived and this watch was on its wrist, it got huge praise, huge acclaim, great advertising, and it's just blossomed ever since. But we should bear in mind that the early model was quartz. It wasn't boasting Co-Axial escapement technology, none of the new tech that we talk about today. On the other hand, it did have a great improvement in its bracelet and clasp department. Now it was fully milled and the bracelet was solid. From the very beginning of Brosnan's tenure, we saw the Seamaster Professional on his wrist. And more than just the watch head, the bracelet is what made it stand out the most. The 9-link construction. Colloquially today, we could call it Omega's tank tread. Rewatching those Brosnan films again, those 4 movies, what I found so effective about the Omega brand placement is that most of the supporting cast, all the main characters were wearing the same watch, but you were never hit over the head with the product placement. And the way that these watches worked as props in the films, it was a masterclass. Nobody would tell you throughout the film. He would just take it off his wrist and it would be a grapple gun. He would take it off and it would be used as a laser emitter. He would pull out the helium release crown and use it as a detonator. I'm going to be honest with you. I grew up in the 90s Bond era, and the Seamaster Professional never appealed to me. This model in particular, it looks like a watch of the 90s. The rounded links on the bracelet, the way it sits, the way it presents itself. But as far as being a gadget in the film, it never failed to impress. And I think beyond its style choices and style cues, the way they integrated this watch into the franchise and used it as an important tool in Bond's arsenal, it made all the difference. So keep that point in mind because we're going to circle back to it in the end. By the time we arrive in the early 2000s, the Craig era of the Bond franchise, the name Omega is pretty much synonymous with Bond as a character. And this was cemented by the famous one-liner used on the train in Casino Royale.
Easy smiles and expensive watches. Rolex.
Omega.
Beautiful.
I really like this scene because it's quite bombastic. I don't think any other Bond character has ever mentioned the watch that he wears in a film. And even throughout the Brosnan era, they never specified the brand. It was always there in the background. But this film pretty much solidified the relationship. And over the course of this movie, he wore both the Seamaster Professional of the time, now using the automatic movement. I think it still had the aluminium bezel, and also an oversized Planet Ocean. Through the other 2 films, Quantum of Solace and Skyfall, we don't have a really unique Bond watch. We see a Planet Ocean being used quite heavily in Quantum of Solace, 42mm, very nice. By the time we reach Skyfall, we see the Aquaterra getting some time in the spotlight. So while the earlier films of the Craig-era Bond had quite a rocky relationship with the iconic Seamaster and which one he would choose, by the time we reach Spectre, it goes in a completely different tangent where all of a sudden we now have screen-accurate models that are made specifically for Bond. And this is where the watches take on a whole new body for themselves. The watches go from just being props and being gadgets in the film to being actual characters. And there's no better example than the Seamaster 300 used in Spectre, which was entirely bespoke. It had a GMT bezel insert, the dial was completely reworked. From a classical interface, it now looks far more modern. Losing the 12 o'clock marker and all the text is shifted up, the Omega logo now at the 12th position. For the first time ever, an Omega was worn on a NATO strap throughout the film, and it suited the watch extremely well. And ever since, over the last 7 or so years, the Bond watch now is its own entity. The most recent No Time to Die edition model, fully titanium, anodized aluminium bezel, dial, mesh bracelet, so many unique innovations and changes to this collection that we had never seen before. The modern Seamaster Professional had returned, but also had some draws to military history and some neoclassical design inspirations. And like in Spectre, where the Seamaster was used as a loud alarm, in this new film it plays less of a big role, but its presence on the wrist is far more noticeable and definitely completes the outfit and the attire that he's going for. And in a way, what made this great is that it was designed not to be stylized as much as being something usable, titanium being lightweight, mesh bracelet being comfortable. The watch's presence, it gave off this militaristic but a classic style that seemed to call back to the 1960s. There's an interesting intersection here. We come to the end of the Craig era of the Bond franchise. The Brosnan era is finished. And to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Bond, a Seamaster is chosen. And the Seamaster Professional is the watch that's being celebrated. What Omega has done with this is masterful because they've taken inspirations from the No Time to Die Seamaster, as well as looking all the way back to the early 90s and the original wave dial pattern and the color scheme used for that model. They've taken these broad stroke inspirations, brought them together and created one of the best examples of a modern Seamaster Professional that has its feet divided in both old and new style choices, but it works exceptionally well. The old school elements, we could say, the mesh bracelet, the wave dial, the color scheme chosen, the full numeral bezel insert, the lollipop seconds hand. The new school, the size and presence of the watch, the size of the plots, the size of the hands. And all of these parts combined makes for an extremely attractive looking watch. I think above and beyond everything else, it's the simplicity of this watch that lets it stand and speak for itself. This is what gives it staying power. Would this not be a better example of a watch that perfectly epitomizes the origins of the Seamaster Professional and how it could cap off this journey of how the watch has developed? And I would say yes, this is a perfect Bond watch for the modern era. Everything, even including the helium escape crown. Because we must remember, we're looking back down 30 years of history, and that helium crown was actually pretty important in the early films. This watch, the way it is composed, the way it's presented to us now, could easily double as a Bond gadget. And that's what makes it so great. And that links to my early point about how I didn't appreciate this watch for its aesthetics, but seeing it in this configuration, it says something different. When I sat back and looked at this watch, you know me, I like going in and editing and scrutinizing and changing bits and pieces. There is nothing about this watch that I actively want to see changed. That in itself is a testament to how neat this watch is. But if we are going to get pedantic, yes, we have to talk about the few things. The mesh bracelet. Now, the Seamaster Professional has always been defined by its tank tread, its 9-link bracelet. This in a way does affect how the watch is perceived. It takes a little bit away from that iconic 90s design, for better or for worse, you decide. The anodized aluminium bezel insert, it looks fantastic. I mean, the color is beautiful, and it's directly in line with the 90s era model up to the early 2000s. But I would have preferred to have seen it in matte ceramic, just for the sake of longevity instead of that historical correctness. The lollipop seconds hand of this watch is perplexing, because it's a style from a completely different era of Seamaster 300. This hand would come from CK2913-3-4. Doesn't really belong with the Seamaster Professional collection. Maybe if I was to get really pedantic, I would want to give it an arrowhead instead of a lollipop hand, just so it corresponds with the sword hands on the dial. Then my only other criticism would be the caseback and the use of the panoramic, the pictogram, whatever you want to call it. It kind of reminds me of things that we would get in the 90s. Maybe that's what they were going for. You know, the idea is novel and it looks nice, but I would much prefer to see this graphic used on a card or on a book that was featured with the watch in the collection, instead of on the glass caseback hiding the movement. What I think is great and even more subtle is they've even included screws on the caseback, which calls back to the early Seamaster 300 and how you would take the casebacks off those models. I think they had 5 or 6 holes that you would actually fit a tool in to open it up. You know, I sit back and look at this watch and I think these were the same designers that were responsible for a watch like the Pelagos FXD, which I still think is just a near flawless tribute to the Marine Nationale partnership that the brand has had. Everything from the colors to the size and presence to the use of loom and scale proportions, Omega has done it with this professional. I love that the result and the final execution is nuanced with touches of old and new inspirations. And that is ultimately what I think makes for a perfect modern tribute. A watch that, yes, is planted firmly in the modern era. You would believe it's a watch that's designed for today, but does have cues and callbacks to classic inspirations, past inspirations, without hitting you over the head with them, without any explanation about the wave dial on this watch. Nobody would know, unless they watched the Bond films, unless they owned the watch themselves, that this was a callback to a 90s era design. I really admire the symmetry, the use of a no-date complication, the bezel with a 60 marker used instead of a triangle, callback to another old-school inspiration. I don't know so much about the green loom used on it, but that's for another time. It's the subtlety and the simplicity of a watch and its execution, understanding its origins, the core traits that made it what it is today, that allows for a watch to have longevity and an everlasting design. That is what this piece represents. That's why it's special. That's why it's worth your attention. A fitting tribute to Bond's relationship with Omega, a 30-year partnership, one of the most popular dive watches in the world, one of the most recognizable watches that continues to look relevant as a design today.